Hello, I'm Dr. Amy Sturgis, and it is my pleasure to join you in exploring A Fortnight in the Wilderness with Alexis de Tocqueville, or as I like to think of it, three things that surprised Tocqueville on the frontier. Alexis de Tocqueville was many things: a French nobleman born in 1805, a diplomat, an author, a political scientist, a historian, a philosopher, a sociologist, and a lifelong friend of Gustave de Beaumont, with whom he traveled to the United States in 1831. Their stated mission, Tocqueville's official purpose for the trip, was to study the U.S. prison system and report back to French authorities about its successes, failures, and innovations. The unofficial but driving goal for the trip was for Tocqueville to study U.S. democracy in action and to understand what it meant, historically, culturally, politically, not only for the United States, but also for the future of his native France, which was navigating a transition between a fading aristocratic order and a democratic future. His treasured side quests during this research trip were spontaneous junkets to the wilds, an opportunity he imagined to live out his own personal James Fenimore Cooper-inspired frontier adventure. One such spur-of-the-moment carpe diem journey took place in August of 1831 and took Tocqueville and Beaumont via steamboat, horse, and canoe from Buffalo to Detroit to Pontiac, and then the remote interior of Michigan to Saginaw. This proved to be an eye-opening journey for Tocqueville. The record of his trip, A Fortnight in the Wilderness, was first published by Beaumont in 1860, a year after Tocqueville's death. It is now often appended to newer editions of Tocqueville's masterwork, Democracy in America. So, what surprised Tocqueville on his frontier adventure, and what conclusions may we draw from those surprises? First, Tocqueville was surprised by his assumption-shattering and, frankly, disillusioning encounter with the treatment experienced by Native Americans in Buffalo. Then, when he had adjusted his expectations accordingly, he found them shattered again on the frontier. In Buffalo, Tocqueville encountered Iroquois people. His expectations were informed first by the noble savage mythology of Romanticism, but also the real history of those who had formed a successful and sustained alliance built on law and cooperation, the Iroquois Confederacy, one of the world's oldest participatory democracies, composed of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora peoples, a powerful league of nations that played a key role in the struggle between the British and the French for a future in the Americas. What Tocqueville found instead of the proud and respected people he anticipated was a distressing tableau of dependency and drunkenness, a people pushed to the margins, mocked and disregarded by the white settler who, Tocqueville noted, quote, "Here's the minister of the gospel, repeat to him that men are brothers," end quote, and yet treated the Iroquois as disposable, as less than human. Tocqueville lamented, quote, "We had before us, it is pitiful to say so, the last remnants of the celebrated Confederation of the Iroquois, whose manly wisdom was no less known, than their courage, and who for a long time held the balance between the two greatest European nations," end quote. He did not disguise either his grief for the Iroquois or his disgust with the Buffalo settlers. Yet, as Noah Stingle notes in Tocqueville in the Wilderness, the tragedy of the aristocracy in the democratic age, from the Political Science Reviewer. By the way, I will cite all of my sources at the end of this presentation, if you'd like to follow up on any of them. Quote, his, that is Tocqueville's, account of the Iroquois in Buffalo contrasts with his description of Native Americans elsewhere in Fortnight, end quote. So what did Tocqueville find when he left Buffalo? Tocqueville encountered multiple natives on his trek into the frontier. For example, he and Beaumont hired a guide identified as Chippewa or Ojibwe, a member of the Anishinaabe people, as well as others, including those in Saginaw. He found their guide, for example, not only highly skilled, informed, and able, a figure to whom he ceded control, a figure who led Tocqueville almost childlike through the forest, but also, if you will, unimprisoned. Quote, the most philosophical of all men, he has few needs and hence few desires. Civilization has no hold on him, end quote. As Tocqueville's travels took him farther into the frontier and ultimately to Saginaw, he described the indigenous peoples he met as disdaining the subjugation that comes with acquisitiveness. The native of the frontier, Tocqueville generalized, quote, smiles bitterly, seeing us torment our lives in order to acquire useless riches. What we call industry, he calls shameful subjection. He compares the farmer to the ox that painfully traces his furrow. What we call the conveniences of life, he calls the toys of children or the refinements of women, end quote. Now, we know Tocqueville viewed these people through his own cultural and especially romantic lens, and also with incomplete information, without, for example, experience with other native nations with different political, economic, and cultural systems, such as those with permanent established towns and agricultural production. But a point that is worth noting to understand Tocqueville is that he viewed indigenous America on the frontier as a representative of, as Stengel puts it, the choice to, quote, value freedom over equality, end quote. Stengel argues that Tocqueville developed a close connection to and identification and fellow feeling with, a, quote, consistent affinity, imagined or otherwise, for Native Americans. And more importantly, he sees them as aristocrats, end quote. What exactly does this mean? Tocqueville saw in the threat to indigenous America on the frontier a potential tragedy, the same potential tragedy he imagined destined for the nobility in France. In his book, Tocqueville and His America, A Darker Horizon, Arthur Caledon notes how Tocqueville's respect for natives on the frontier. As Tocqueville said admiringly, quote, in the forest, the Indian was a master, completely in control of his environment, end quote, is infused with a sense that they are both in peril from what was to come. One night in Saginaw, for example, Tocqueville experienced a violent thunderstorm. As Caledon says, quote, Tocqueville again implies a kinship with the Indian, who becomes a surrogate for his apprehensions about the future, end quote. To quote Tocqueville now about the unnamed native who weathered the storm with him, quote, did he see in the clash of the elements something other than a passing convulsion of nature? These fleeting images of civilization that loomed up as if by themselves amid the tumult of the wilderness. Did they have a prophetic meaning for him? End quote. Caledon reads this quite rightly, I think, to imply that Tocqueville saw a prophetic meaning for his own class in the same way he saw one for the natives' race, that the march of democracy and all that would entail would be for them a coming storm. To return to Stengel, quote, understood as a metaphor, the energy from the lightning seems to melt Tocqueville and the Native American together as two aristocrats fleeing the destructive forces of democracy, end quote. Or, to put it another way, Tocqueville in his highly romanticized reading, which I must underscore tells us far more about him than the natives he met, imagined that in the future, when faced with the choice of freedom or equality, more people would choose, like the white settlers who toiled for their muslin curtains to match their neighbors' muslin curtains, and few would choose like the aristocrat of the forest, like their Chippewa guide, like a lover of liberty and independence. In summary, Tocqueville hoped to encounter the proud warriors he'd read about in fiction as he lived out his own Cooper-esque romance sort of adventure there on the frontier, but instead he drew two unexpected conclusions. First, in Buffalo, he gleaned the tragedy of democracy in the city, which he saw in the form of white hypocrisy and prejudice, and the resulting debasement and demoralization of the Iroquois. And second, in the wilderness, he found a sophisticated nobility in the Chippewa guide that he and Beaumont hired, and the other indigenous people he met, an impression that inspired identification and fellow feeling, a sense of connection that he incorporated into what Stengel calls, quote, Tocqueville's tragic forecast for aristocracy in the democratic age, end quote. Tocqueville's encounters with Native Americans weren't the only experiences that challenged his assumptions. Let's talk about another surprise the frontier had in store for Tocqueville. It seems clear that Tocqueville expected, based on his understanding of human nature and his perspective as a social scientist, that his journey from the city to the wilderness, as it related to white settlers, would be a kind of journey through time, a trip of sociocultural archaeology, if you will, in which he might see civilization, as he understood it, devolving into more primitive iterations the farther he moved away from concentrated populations and into the frontier. The US city dweller, he imagined, was a different creature, or at least a creature of different ideas, different cultural habits, different advancement than the settler in the forest. He was wrong. US settler identity proved to be much more complicated than he assumed. To be fair, identity in the city and in the wilderness, among indigenous people and settlers alike, could be confusing for Tocqueville, blurring boundaries and descriptions. A French-Canadian pioneer might dress like a native might dress like an Englishman. Tocqueville learned that people's ethnic appearance or cultural dress might not be the clue he had thought it would be about which language they spoke. And of course, individuals of multiracial or multinational heritage made categories even less useful or relevant. This blurring or blending of identities, however, spoke to fluidity. That was not the big surprise. Let's just spell it out. If Tocqueville found that whites' treatment of the Iroquois in Buffalo was a great disappointment, well, he found everyone's treatment of the other in the remote town of Saginaw, whether the other was defined by race, religion, or nationality of origin. That was a terrible disappointment too. So let's start with Saginaw. In a rugged and inhospitable pocket of settlement in the middle of the frontier, where he expected to find toleration and cooperation as necessities for individual and community survival, in the self-interest of everybody involved, he found instead prejudice. Quote, they are hardly 30 in the middle of a wilderness in which everything rejects their efforts. The prejudices of education and birth divide them. Where to find in a more narrow frame a more complete picture of the miseries of our nature, end quote. As Ava Atanasoff notes in Fortnight in the Wilderness, Tocqueville on Nature and Civilization in Perspectives on Political Science, quote, Saginaw furnishes Tocqueville with evidence that the similarity of basic needs in equally adverse circumstances does not suffice for the forging of social ties. Insurmountable differences obstruct the way to solidarity and possible union among the settlers. Prejudices of origin and upbringing form insuperable barriers between them, which their varying religions, quote, extend beyond the tomb, end quote. Witnessing, quote, the profound lines that birth and opinion trace around human destiny, end quote, Tocqueville points above all to the inflexibility of national dispositions as the root cause of the divisions precluding the new society from being born, end quote. Even settlers who should, because of their common backgrounds, have developed common ground in the United States, as Tocqueville noted, Quote, before coming to America, their fathers had lived under the same European sky. An arm of the sea more narrow than the St. Lawrence River separated their countries, end quote. England and France found themselves facing off across a seemingly impenetrable divide in the small village of Saginaw, with different approaches to daily life, different goals for the future, the French mingling with indigenous Americans and the English separating themselves from them, with each group further divided into a total of 6 unlike religious traditions that further splintered the village for its members, in life and even in death. What Tocqueville observed in Saginaw disturbed him, and it disrupted his understanding of a common human nature that allows each person to find something similar, something familiar and recognizable in the other, something that allows us to adapt, to grow. Instead, in Saginaw, Tocqueville saw that, quote, something inflexible shows through in the midst of human flexibility, end quote. Or, as Atanasoff puts it, quote, the wilds of America present Tocqueville with compelling proof that at the bottom of pliant human nature, there is an obstinate adherence to one's own way of life, or else a national character, end quote. So, transplanted English people clung to their Englishness. Transplanted French people clung to their Frenchness. Where among the settlers from Europe, beyond Saginaw, might there be a national character that represented a homegrown U.S. identity as opposed to a transplanted one? In A Fortnight in the Wilderness, on his adventure in the wilds, Tocqueville discovered such a character. Again, what he observed on the frontier surprised him and overturned his expectations. Instead of the city frontier or city wilderness dichotomy he had imagined, the theoretical trip back in time, he found in the wilderness the seeds of a uniform national character, unique to the United States, growing in homesteads, in families, isolated in log cabins in the forest, in pioneers. The same seeds he found growing in the cities. As Stengel notes of this uniform national character, quote, traveling westward, he, Tocqueville, does not observe any change. Quote, the merchant of Buffalo and of Detroit is as well stocked as he of New York, end quote. And in French fashions, no less. The people are universally uniform as well. They have the, quote, same clothes, same attitude, same language, same habits, same pleasures, end quote. In New York, as on the frontier. In a crudely built cabin that appears to be the, quote, asylum of all miseries, end quote, one can find an American who, quote, will trace out for you on paper a plan of campaign for the Belgians and will gravely inform you what remains to be done for the prosperity of France, end quote. During Tocqueville's adventure, as recounted in A Fortnight in the Wilderness, one pioneer and his family in the forest struck Tocqueville as representative of not only the frontier American, but also the American, full stop. Quote, this unknown man is the representative of a restless, reasoning, and adventurous race, a nation of conquerors who submit to leading savage life without ever letting themselves be carried away by its sweet pleasures, who love civilization and enlightenment only when they are useful for well-being, and who shut themselves up in the wilderness of America with an ox and some newspapers, end quote. The pioneer man, Tocqueville noted, quote, has only one thought and advances toward the acquisition of wealth, the only goal of its efforts, with a perseverance and a scorn for life that you could call heroic if the word was suitable for something other than the efforts of virtue, end quote. The exhausted, faded, resigned pioneer woman and the, quote, half-dressed children shining with health, true sons of the wilderness, end quote, were, in Tocqueville's analysis, to the pioneer man, quote, a detached portion of himself, end quote. Quote, so ardent, so tenacious, so implacable, end quote, this American was capable of great effort and practical industry, and material acquisition, but not, Tocqueville thought, great imagination or culture, art, or insight. The drive behind what the cabin represented, the restless, perpetual movement west, the constant desire for more, this Tocqueville saw across the United States. And he saw this notably, not as he expected, from mainly the newly arrived, but in particular from those born and or raised in America. In Tocqueville's experience of a sameness, a uniformity across his travels, and his fascination with the family and the log cabin as a symbol, William R. Cook, in Tocqueville and the American Experiment, sees Tocqueville as a precursor to, or a thinker who anticipated, the influential U.S. figure Frederick Jackson Turner. In 1893, over 60 years after Tocqueville spent his fortnight in the wilderness, University of Wisconsin historian Frederick Jackson Turner presented his essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. In this now famous frontier thesis, which has shaped U.S. rhetoric from popular songs to presidential addresses, Turner suggested that the difference between the United States and other countries, including the European nations who explored and or colonized North America before the United States became a country, was the experience of the frontier. In Turner's words, quote, the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development, end quote. Although he noted that many factors contributed to the evolution of the nation, Turner argued that the existence of the frontier was the single most important factor in shaping the U.S. national character, and that the institutions and practices now inextricably linked with American identity, such as capitalism and social and geographic mobility, and, of course, democracy, developed due to and in the unique context of the country's long experience with the frontier. According to Turner, this frontier experience is exceptional in U.S. history. It's exceptional in human history, and thus, so is the United States. So this frontier experience, according to Turner, makes the U.S. exceptional. Now, Turner's thesis is highly contested, and it's contested for ample reasons. We could spend a full semester deconstructing the exclusions and the assumptions that informed Turner's theory, starting with his assertion that the continent itself was free land. It wasn't. And I should underscore, Tocqueville was studying the U.S. experience in part to find out what was not exceptional. In other words, what he could take back with him to France to use in understanding what was happening in his native country. But Turner's thesis has gone on to become an integral part of the popular national rhetoric, and its influence is so pervasive that scholars of the United States and Western history to this day frame their own arguments in the context of and in response to Turner's. Of the qualities that Turner identified in 1893 as indicative of the so-called American character, he described the following, these striking characteristics, the American intellect, if you will. Quote, that coarseness and strength combined with acuteness and inquisitiveness, that practical inventive turn of mind, quick to find expedients, that masterful grasp of material things, lacking in the artistic, but powerful to effect great ends, that restless, nervous energy, that dominant individualism, working for good and for evil, and with all that buoyancy and exuberance that comes with freedom. These are traits of the frontier, or traits called out elsewhere because of the frontier, end quote. Whether we agree or disagree with the historical accuracy of Turner's assessment, we can see the enduring power of the frontier hero archetype, that pioneer he described. And we can see it imagined and reimagined in popular culture. The Western characters portrayed by actors such as John Wayne and Clint Eastwood have embodied many of these characteristics. as have fictional science fiction heroes, projecting the notion of the frontier into space or into the future, such as Han Solo, Malcolm Reynolds, and others, like the recent Pedro Pascal roles of Din Djarin in The Mandalorian and Joel Miller in The Last of Us. We can also see, I think, how Turner's American intellect reflects what Tocqueville described when he analyzed the pioneer he met in the log cabin in the forest, that, quote, representative of a restless, reasoning, and adventurous race, end quote. Cook recognizes Tocqueville as a thinker who anticipated Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, linking the influence of the wilderness to the American intellect and to its institutions like democracy. But Cook isn't the only one who connects the dots between Tocqueville and Turner. Michael Zuckerman in the Journal of American History notes, quote, Alexis de Tocqueville tried to tell us he saw that suppositions of aristocracy and deference could not be sustained in America. Making sense of America meant making sense of the intricate choreography that guided our deference, not to any entrenched elite, but to each other, the perennial minuet of mutual suppression that he called the tyranny of the majority. Frederick Jackson Turner tried to tell us, too. He saw that the wilderness was inherently inimical to pretensions on birth. American characteristics assuredly had their origins in Europe, but they were decisively modified on the successive frontiers of the New World. Understanding the country and its distinctive culture meant understanding an unprecedented democracy and equality, end quote. So what did what did Tocqueville take away from his encounters with U.S. settlers? In Saginaw, he saw that divisions took precedence even over self-interest. The identities of immigrants, for example, had their roots in their parent cultures, and the worst expression of this was a perpetual, inflexible sense of us and them. But he found as well a national American character taking shape across the United States, one that not only pushed born and bred Americans even farther west, but also one that echoed back east as well. An egalitarian identity defined by an awareness of and experience with the concept of the frontier, a single-minded, practical, relentless push for more. This national character was a surprise, and the wilderness itself had more surprises in store. Tocqueville expected adventure and awe, but he failed to anticipate the sense of loss he felt encountering the forests of America. Quote, it is this idea of destruction, this lurking thought of a near and inevitable change that, according to us, gives to the wilderness of America so original a character and so touching a beauty. You see it with a melancholy pleasure. You hurry, in a way, to admire it, end quote. Here again, we meet Tocqueville's Romanticism. We also meet some tropes that should be unpacked. First, much of Tocqueville's assessment of the frontier, as was Frederick Jackson Turner's later, was based on the false assumption of an untouched wilderness. Tocqueville could, in fact, balance the notion of the forest being unpeopled, unperceived, even in a way almost undiscovered, with the parallel observation that the Chippewas and their allies moved through it with long familiarity and ease. As U.S. historian Francis Jennings has famously noted in his path-breaking work, The Invasion of America, quote, the American land was more like a widow than a virgin. Europeans did not find a wilderness here, rather they made one. The so-called settlement of America was a resettlement, a reoccupation of a land made waste by the diseases and demoralization introduced by the newcomers, end quote. And I would add, a great deal of killing. My point is that romanticizing the frontier at times meant erasure of its past history and the history of its indigenous inhabitants. Second, the vanishing wilderness trope and its related one, the vanishing Indian trope, speaks to a kind of romantic determinism that suggests both we don't know what we've got until it's gone, and that the vanishing is inevitable, predetermined, and thus there is nothing we can do, no agency we can exercise to halt the process. For the tragedy, we are absolved. I should note that the frontier always seems to be vanishing in US self-perception. In fact, 3 years prior to Frederick Jackson Turner's presentation of his frontier thesis, a US government census report declared the US frontier officially closed. The open West had been filled up, it said. Turner's thesis then was both a celebration of the frontier and a eulogy for it. The wilderness, the frontier, is always vanishing, it seems. I should also underscore, of course, that the related vanishing Indian trope has justified a host of private and state injustices and atrocities. It's also proven to be false. Native America lives. The Iroquois Confederacy, the peoples of the Longhouse, live. The Chippewa live. And as a student of indigenous futurisms, I can attest to the fact that Native peoples today are imagining their tomorrows, even as centuries of settlers and visitors have projected them into the past. All that said, part of Tocqueville's lament for the physical wilderness was tied up in his perception of and warning about the nature of the American character and what the US march westward would mean for the continent. And I don't want to discount that very real and very prescient concern. That warning about the physical transformation of American land, of the environment, that's one we can still heed. One last and truly personal surprise was left for Tocqueville. The wilderness, simply put, freaked him out. Tocqueville described his experience of physically being in the wilderness in a dreamlike, at times hallucinatory term. His sense of isolation, of both sensory overload and sensory deprivation, of downright fear, comes through in his prose, in the language he chose. He had been in forests before, of course, but not like those in the United States. He wrote, quote, "Life and death here are as if face to face. They seem to have wanted to mix and mingle their work. When at midday the rains of the sun beat down on the forest, you often hear echoing in its depths something like a long moan. Then everything around you falls into a silence so profound and immobility so complete that your soul feels penetrated by a sort of religious terror," end quote. And here I would like to point out that Tocqueville's descriptions not only reflected French Romanticism, but they also anticipated a new tradition that already flourished at the time of his trip and continues to do so, the American Gothic. In fact, the father of both the American Gothic and, for that matter, the American novel, Charles Brockden Brown, described the forest, the frontier, in similarly romantic and Gothic, dreamlike and nightmarish terms, in works such as 1799's Edgar Huntley or Memoirs of a Sleepwalker, a novel that would help set the precedent for the American wilderness, the frontier, the forest, in US storytelling, as a reflection and repository for individuals and communities, fear for the future and guilt for the past. By the way, Charles Brockden Brown also used the Gothic to examine his own political and economic views on American nation building, commerce, and democracy. So consider this my, if you liked A Fortnight in the Wilderness, you might like the novels of Charles Brockden Brown pitch. But I digress, and I must conclude my remarks here. Tocqueville encountered many surprises in his Fortnight in the Wilderness, surprises that leave us with much to think about. Tocqueville, interestingly enough, left us a work that inspires a great deal of conversation and study, and one of the words that seems to recur most in scholarship about A Fortnight in the Wilderness is tragedy. While the work is full of wonder, fascination, and adventure, it's not exactly a feel-good read. There is the tragedy of the hypocrisy Tocqueville noted in the inhumane treatment of natives by whites, the tragedy of the inflexibility and prejudice he identified among divided communities whose members had every reason to cooperate, the tragedy of a stunningly rich, diverse, varied, breathtaking continent that he admired, yielding a new country with a surprisingly uninformed, or at least uninspired, uniform culture. The tragedy of what he anticipated was the fate of the aristocracy in a democratic age, whether he understood aristocracy as the nobility of indigenous people who resist the acquisitive, imprisoning habits of the settlers, or the French ideas of, well, less the elite for elitism's sake, although that certainly is there, but more a way of life that, in theory at least, nurtured greatness, almost classical in nature. Values he believed could be endangered in the atmosphere and culture of democracy. And the tragedy of what might vanish as the American character pushed west, expanded, and sought more and more. Tocqueville read the United States through the lens of his own country, his own family's history, his own concerns for the future, and a host of romantic tropes. But he also challenged his readers to think about the frontier, about the American character, and about how cultural and political life would transform in the United States, on the North American continent, and far beyond in a democratic age. I'm glad we have the opportunity together to take an imaginative journey with him for A Fortnight in the Wilderness. Here are some of the sources I cited during my presentation. And with that, I thank you.